giant robots duking it out in one-on-one combat. A concept so cool and over the top, like it's been made for the 90s. And what comes to mind if you think about robot fighting video games from that era? Rise of the Robots, the overhyped graphical showpiece that offered very little on the gameplay side, or maybe One Must Fall 2097, still one of the best fighting games ever in my book. If you say Menticide, oh boy, I'm sorry you had such a rough childhood. This forgotten Korean PC game takes inspiration from both of the big shots but falls short in both graphics and gameplay. Quick message from today's sponsor, which is me, or my new game It Returned to the Desert, now out on Steam. It's an homage to 90s turn-based tactics and adventure game. You have to defend the town of Glindrock against giant ants and try to convince the townsfolk to join your party in a non-linear story. And a few minigames are sprinkled in there as well. So think of XCOM mixed with point-and-click adventures game and a bit of party and resource management. If you're interested in the game, you can find a link in the video description below. And with that done, back to our video.
Ready? Fight!
So let's get over the gameplay of Menticide really quick. You fight against an enemy robot by performing kicks and punches. You can also jump and duck. When your health bar reaches 0, you lose. There's also an energy bar that fills up over time or when you land attacks and gets depleted when you get hit yourself. If you have enough energy, you can perform a special attack. From what I've gathered, there's only a single special attack per character and they are all quite similar. There's a single player mode where you can choose from 10 different bots and fight the other 9 plus a boss at the end. If you manage to defeat the boss, you get a short render cutscene, and there's also your obligatory versus mode where you can fight against another player. And that's about it. If you compare this feature set to One Must Fall, you see that you get a whole less game for your buck. There's no tournament mode, no pilots, no multi-stage finishing moves, no news reports or any story to speak of, no customization and no network multiplayer. In that regard, it's a lot more similar to Rise of the Robots, but instead of the cool short introductory scenes, you will only get a few bland still images. What I have to say though is that I kinda like the robot designs. I mean, don't get me wrong, they look terrible. But I'm a sucker for that 90s render look, and especially the Manticore end boss design made me laugh out loud. You can see that they definitely put some effort into the game. Some of the backgrounds, for example, don't look too bad, but in the end the game just didn't come together and they cut a few too many corners. But how does the gameplay feel? If you compare it to Rise of the Robots, I would say quite favorably, but that doesn't say much when Rise is notorious for its stiff control, slow movement and horrible AI. Menticide is definitely a bit more responsive, but it has its own quirks. For example, if you don't press the punch or kick button at the exact right moment in the air, you will just jump into an enemy without performing an attack. The AI's erratic behavior doesn't help, and the best strategy that allowed me to complete the whole game was just by pressing the punch button over and over again. The only enemy that I couldn't defeat this way was a robot that threw me all over the place. I assume that's due to a bug where for that bot the distance check is missing and he can throw you even when he's nowhere near your character. Speaking of bugs, I also encountered some weird pushbacks during fights where I suddenly ended up in one corner of the screen for no apparent reason. So where Rise borders on the edge of unplayable, Menticide can be a bit of fun for a few minutes if someone is holding a gun to your head and says smile. Now what's also interesting to me is the context in which the game was released. From what I can tell, it was never sold in the US despite the English translation. The developer Cyan Art, formerly known as Sigmatech Studio, did release the adventure of Tippy in the West in 1995, a very mediocre platformer, especially if you consider that games like Earthworm Jim 2 and Rayman released the same year. Menticide was released in 1996 and the company ceased game development altogether a year later. So Rise of the Robots and One Must Fall, which both released in 1994, were around for about 2 years at that time, which makes sense considering that Menticide definitely took some inspiration from those games. We know quite a few big games coming from Korea nowadays, like Lost Ark, Black Desert Online or MapleStory, but they had been developed after the online gaming revolution in Korea took place. There wasn't a big gaming industry before the internet cafes and esport era, as gaming had not yet achieved mainstream status. So it's understandable that Menticide fell behind games from Western studios with bigger budgets. Bizarrely, CN Art had also developed another fighting game 1 year prior to Menticide, with a name I won't even attempt to pronounce, but a much easier subtitle, The Great Fighter. And this game is surprisingly good. Sure, it doesn't get anywhere near the likes of Street Fighter, but it's a decent button masher that controls well enough. It even boasts online multiplayer if you had a modem back then. It was developed by a different team though, only the producer stayed to work on Menticide. So my best guess is that they took the engine from The Great Fighter, add bits of pieces and inspiration from Rise of the Robots and One Must Fall, and rushed the thing out the door. But well, that's mere speculation, there's not a lot of information about the game or the company as a whole. Maybe that's just my obsession with giant robot games, but I found this thing fascinating, and I know as a kid I would have played it no matter the quality. I hope you found this video interesting as well, and if you did so, please consider subscribing to the channel. And don't forget to click the bell or YouTube won't show you new videos coming up on my channel. And with that, see ya!